Hey guys, Cybertron. Relax, I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you? Beastcoast Pokemon, what is up? It is Aaron, Cybertron Zhang, and I'm here joined by James Beck, and we are here to dive into the metagame and talk about everything that's been happening in Series 12 VGC. It's actually been a while since we've done one of these, and there have been a lot of results since we have done one. So really excited to talk about all the majors that have happened recently and all the meta developments. But before we get started, James, how are you?
I'm doing well. We haven't done one of these in quite a while, so we have a lot of tournaments to catch up to, like 5 or 6, but I'm always excited to like look back at these and like see how it's progressed, because really there have been a lot of changes since our last recap, and I'm excited to get into it.
So once again, if this is content that you guys like, would really appreciate if you guys could leave a like on the video, give us any feedback down in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to Beastcoast Pokemon. We're doing all kinds of things here and really trying to build it out. And yeah, hopefully you enjoy. So without further ado, let's just get started with the first major, which was EUIC, the European International Championships, which took place at this point really a couple of weeks ago. And James, I think the top 8 for that tournament was really interesting because there was actually a lot of different restricted duos that cracked the top 8, and a lot that we actually haven't seen too much since then.
Yeah, I mean, we have literally, well, let's go over a few of the interesting teams. I mean, we had Reshiram and Calyrex Ice, which was like one of the first major appearances of this duo, really. We had Gilgamesh, who also actually used this team. He got top 32, I believe, at Liverpool Regionals with a very similar, if not the same 6, but changed a few of the sets. And it was really interesting to see how this duo played, because we haven't really seen too much Reshiram. We saw Palkia with Calyrex Ice Rider, but there was none of those in the top 8. We saw Reshiram though, and the Reshiram actually really did put in work, and it's a really hard restricted for some teams to handle, especially like Zacian. It's really good at countering, especially.
Yeah, I think one thing that was really fun about this tournament was that the top 8, just like we've seen at a lot of the other, regionals, I think there was actually like 7 unique restricted pairings, right? So it was like Zacian, Groudon, Zacian, Kyogre on top, but then you had Yveltal, Groudon, Lunala, Groudon, Zacian, Dialga, Reshiram, Calyrex, and Yveltal plus Zacian. So once again, Zacian reigned supreme. And, one thing that was a big deal from this tournament was Eric Rios winning with Rinya's son, right? Because that was the one team that was kind of sweeping all the events, and Eric also managed to conquer not only regionals, but, the major with it here. But what's really interesting is that since then, that team has actually completely fallen off, and I think, honestly, many players just aren't using it anymore. When I was commentating at Indy, actually, taking note of what restricted duos a lot of players or top players were using, very few had actually opted for Zacian Groudon to begin with, and like Aaron Schurler was one of the only players in Indianapolis to actually bring Rinya's son to the tournament. So you might still see it, I think, in some of the earlier rounds, but overall now, like, there just aren't that many players using it to begin with, which I think is a really interesting trend.
Yeah, I think when we saw the top 64 teams from EUIC, which are the ones that got points, I believe they're only like 2 or 3 Rinya's son teams at the most. I believe Eric was one out of probably only 2 teams, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, only 1 out of 2. The other one was got 31st, piloted by Andrea. And yeah, I think the team was already kind of dying down. A lot of players already knew what to really expect, but I think Eric just really understood the team to another level and really just took it and pushed it to the limits right there, and was able to claim that first place, which I think Eric was definitely capable of. Of course, winning that one regional, he had already a lot of experience with the team, so I think he just understood the team more than other players. Probably had like an idea of what techs he needed in order to perform well, and yeah, he was just able to really play immaculately throughout the entire tournament.
2 of the big trends from that tournament coming out for me were, first of all, Zacian Kyogre still is just really good, right? Like, it finished 2nd and 3rd in the tournament, and it's done very well at the majors recently as well. At Indianapolis specifically, like, I felt like half the field was essentially using Zacian Kyogre. Now, it wasn't actually half the field, but so many good players decided to just go with Zacian Ogre and support it with the standard support that you expect to see. And then, like, the interesting restricted pairs, like Lunala and Groudon, Casti actually finished in the top 8 with, and we've seen some Lunadons perform well since then. Wolfie actually just got top 4 at regionals with it as well. A bunch of different ways that you can run that composition. And as you mentioned, Calyrex Ice Rider and Reshiram also finished 2nd at Indianapolis. So we'll cover those regionals in a little bit, but I feel like, these teams kind of laid the groundwork for some of the future teams from the more recent regionals.
Yeah, especially I think the Venusaur trend, because Venusaur wasn't as common, I think, of a Pokemon as before EUIC. But then you see like 3 in the top cut. One of them was, and all 3 of them had a Sun mode. 2 of them were Groudon, 1 of them were Torkoal. And I think it's just like, of course, Sleep Powder gives you another win con. Vine Lash, of course, is amazing. And yeah, we do see a lot of trends that from this tournament that do play a role in the future results. But why don't we get started with like the weekend, I believe, which was Indianapolis and oh boy, the special event. I cannot remember the name.
it was Bilbao, I believe.
Special event.
We could start with Indianapolis here. This one was really interesting to me because I actually like did not see a lot of these trends coming, right? So first of all, Zacian and Kyogre ended up winning the tournament, but there were a couple of really cool things on that winning team. It was, bulky Assault Vest Kyogre with Hyper Beam to deal with Gastrodon, and then it was also Safety Goggles, Eerie Impulse Zapdos, which I thought was a really smart meta tech for Venusaur. You just talked about how, Venusaur trended upwards, which I completely agree with. I think it was definitely more popular in Europe than it was in NA before EUIC, it felt like. And then afterwards, I think a lot of players realized, hey, Venusaur is still really good. So even though, Pengi won Indianapolis with what looks like a very standard 6, he had some very, cool item choices and move choices that gave him a big edge on the meta. And, that's, I think, a really smart way to approach Pokemon, right? You take what you think is the best team and just adapt it to your playstyle and to what you think will counter what people will use.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note that this Pengi actually was very comfortable with this 6. He actually used it.
Yeah.
I believe he competed in UIC. He didn't do too hot, but he did compete, I believe, at the Liverpool Regional Championship and got top 8 with the exact same 6. I think they were like slightly different spreads, but pretty much all were pretty consistent, I believe, with his winning team. So I mean, it's just really interesting. I think we'll notice a trend throughout all these events, but most of the players who have done well or won their tournament, their respective tournament, has ended up using their restricted duo and most of their team for like throughout the entire season so far. We'll definitely see that trend later on, but Pengi is no exception to it, as he's really comfortable with the team. He knows how to pilot it. And yeah, it's no surprise that he was able to really dominate, I think, this field right here.
Once again, the top 8 teams here, there were 3 kind of more standard Zacian and Kyogre teams with Pengi. We also had Paul Ruiz, the 2018 world champion, as well as Andrew Ding, kind of using similar Zacian Ogre teams, each with their own different takes though. But then what's really interesting is some of the other restricted duos, right? So Calyrex, Ice Rider, Reshiram ended up finishing 2nd in the tournament. I thought Jeremy Rodriguez made it look really good, honestly. And you also had Palkia, Calyrex, Ice Rider with Gothitelle from Alex Underhill. Austin Acosta had this really cool, honestly, Calyrex Groudon core. I really like Calyrex Groudon when the season first started, and I think the way Austin played in that tournament was really cool, where it was like you just take advantage of Gigantamax, get a lot of residual damage across the board, and then just close out the game with Sash Calyrex Shadow Rider. And so, yeah, glad to see people explore Calyrex a little bit outside of just Zacian. We had Leonard Kraft at 7th with Reshiram and Calyrex Ice Rider as well. And then Carson Comfer used the Hyper Offense Kyogre plus Specs Calyrex Shadow Rider team. So once again, in the top 8, like multiple restricted cores. This time around, it's, pretty heavily dominated by Zacian Kyogre and, interestingly enough, Calyrex Reshiram. But a lot of, diversity once again in terms of the duos.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to know that most of these teams aren't like the most original. Like we've seen kind of like composition of these before, right? Carson's been using a very standard Calyrex Shadow Rider Kyogre team that's done really well on the Showdown ladder for like a couple of months now. And we've seen like all the Zacian Kyogre cores are pretty much adjustments, and then you pretty much just see like what players really are comfortable with. For instance, Alex Underhill, he is very used to using Shadow Tag in his playstyle. He was a very big fan of using Mega Gengar back in Gen 7, and I think it was just like a comfortable addition of using Gothitelle. He knew his strengths, how to position well with the Shadow Tag and really disrupt opponents, and I feel like again, a comfort factor is just such a big thing in this format, and I think a lot of players did have this case right here. And for instance, Jeremy also had like a different adjustment using the Tapu Fini on the Reshiram team compared to the Gastrodon, which we saw at EUIC. And I think the Tapu Fini, the missed Tapu Fini, also just a new tech that's being added on. We're seeing these slight adjustments to teams we've already seen in the past, like Calyrex Ice Rider Reshiram has basically been a thing we've seen with Palkia, especially before in the past, now being a Reshiram. But we're seeing these slight adjustments that are just really pushing the teams to like new limits, and I really love that these small little adjustments just change different matchups so much.
Absolutely, yeah. I think to me, I don't know about you, but I just really didn't have Reshiram Calyrex Ice Rider on my radar at, like, I wouldn't say at all, but I was, didn't expect to see it actually perform so well at this tournament. Like, we had it at 2nd place, we had it at 7th place, we had it at 9th place, and so to see 3 of them make the top 16 definitely caught me off guard. One other really cool team I want to call out from the top 16 of this tournament was Nathan Ortiz using Kyurem White plus Calyrex Shadow Rider. This very interesting take on hyper offense. It was Life Orb 4 attack Kyurem White, Choice Band Urshifu, Choice Scarf Ditto, and Custap Berry Talonflame. So I actually haven't really played the team or gone up against it, but it's really cool to see like stuff like this break into the top 16, right? Because it's just so unorthodox relative to what everyone else is using.
I've tested out the Talonflame set, and Endure Custap Berry is just such an interesting technique where sometimes in certain situations, like, you know, like Talonflame will get faked out, or like its Gale Wings will get broken by like a max move to protect, and it's like can't really do anything, and then you lose the priority for Tailwind, and that's a little bit of a problem. But the Custap Berry, I think Endure is like a really 5-head strategy where you're able to, like, if you're able to get put into the Custap Berry range, you are going to be able to get a decently prioritized a Tailwind, assuming they don't have like another priority in the form of like Grassy Glide or something else. But yeah, I think it's just like really cool tricks that were showcased here.
One of the other regionals that took place that weekend, or a special event I should say, was this event in Spain. And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's actually pretty interesting to compare like the EU metagame to the US metagame, because it feels actually pretty different. So, you know, in EU, very still heavily dominated by Zacian Kyogre and Zacian Groudon, but it was actually Calyrex Shadow Rider and Kyogre that ended up taking first place. You know, that duo is not exactly the most common. You had Lunala plus Groudon in the top 8, and you actually had a Solgaleo plus Calyrex Shadow Rider. That was definitely a pair that I didn't expect to see, but, you know, has performed somewhat at previous events. I think Solgaleo, honestly, I was a big fan of it, as you may know, but it's just a lot harder to use right now, especially with, I think, Calyrex, Lunala, and Yveltal usage all kind of picking up. Like, I just don't think it's, like, in the best place in the format right now. But overall, yeah, it was cool to see Calyrex and Kyogre win, because I don't think I would have predicted that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think a lot of the teams, I mean, we have Antonio, who ran the same team as Victor Medina, top 4 at EUIC. We saw like the same team that got second place from Oliver, piloted by Oriole, and I hope I pronounced that right, but yeah, I mean, I think we've seen like a lot of these teams before. Maybe there's like some small additions here and there. Like we see the Snorlax in 7th place right here on the Zacian Groudon team with more of a hyper offensive mode with Whimsicott Charizard. I think it's really cool. I believe that the Snorlax is Yawn, if I'm not mistaken, to help out with the Trick Room Thick Fat for Calyrex Ice Rider, but I believe that's what the set is. And yeah, I think like a lot of the cool teams, we basically seen like a lot of these teams perform well. I believe Juan also used a team that was piloted by Francesco Pardini and a few other players that got day 2 at EUIC. So pretty much the Euro meta has pretty much stayed very consistent for the most part. And the only really big difference is that the Calyrex Shadow Kyogre really won. And I think one of the trends that really came out after EUIC is, sure, Groudon did win the event, but afterward, I think Kyogre has been pretty strong. It did also win the Indianapolis, and it will win a few more results, as we'll see later.
Yeah, definitely. I think my favorite thing, by the way, James, like scrolling through the results past the top 8, is seeing some of the Pokemon that like I just would never have expected to see. You've got Porygon Z at 13 place, Cradilly at 14 place, and once you scroll even further down, it gets even more wild. There's a Necrozma Duskmane Kyogre team in 28th, and I think that duo, having played against it, is actually pretty cool. Necrozma is just kind of hard to use in the format, in my opinion, but we haven't really seen too many players explore it too much, so that, you know, is pretty neat to see. There's an Umbreon down at 34th, a Slowbro down at 36th, and I believe if you go even further down at 47th, there's a Sneasel.
Yeah, there's some crazy teams. There's also Zamazenta Zygarde at 51 right there, and yeah, there's actually quite a few Umbreons, I believe. We see Sableye, Ditto, Casper. We got top 32 at EUIC as well. He got like a 60th here. Yeah, there's always just like, I think, a lot of cool teams and just a lot of interesting picks usually, especially around these ranges.
Let's move on to the next tournament here, which I believe there were 2 regionals on the same weekend. This was actually just last weekend, and that's one in France and one in Secaucus, or New Jersey, I should say.
Let's go over the French one, I guess, because I mean, it's also part of Europe, and with the trend of Europe, Zacian Kyogre has been, of course, a really popular duo, especially I think in Europe. I think it's definitely dropped a little bit more in the US in terms of top placements, but oh boy, Zacian Kyogre, there's this one team that Hari and a few other French players absolutely love. It's the Zacian Kyogre Incineroar Cortana Shedinja and Support Thunderous combination. and we saw 3 of them in the top 8, which is absolutely incredible.
James, I don't know if you've played against it, but Shedinja, like that Shedinja set has Endure, right? And it's Focus Sash.
Yep.
And, you know, a lot of Shedinjas, that's kind of the standard set right now. But that team itself is just like a nightmare to go up against because Shedinja just has such good defensive synergy. And it's like, I like have to guess so many ally switches. I feel like I call it wrong all the time. The Thunderous like defensive set, honestly, is also just still really smart. I think even now, like people know about it, right? People know it's that like Eerie Impulse, prankster kind of supportive Thunderous. But even with that knowledge, it's still an incredibly powerful pick just because Eerie Impulse is so good into things like Caloric Shadow Rider, for example. So yeah, I mean, Zacian Kyogre is still just one of the most consistent duos, and this team just has a lot of like annoying things to fight against. And yeah, Hari, as you mentioned, really having an amazing season for himself. Like he's had so many good placements and finally taking home a major win on his home turf as well. That was really cool to see. But yeah, I think it's no coincidence that there were 3 copies of this team in the top 8, all used by French players.
Yeah, and then we kind of look back and we see like some pretty much common restricted duos. We saw Lunala Groudon with Charizard Venusaur get second place, piloted by Julio. We have like a hyper offensive version of a Zacian Calyx Shadow Rider version with Charizard and Whimsicott getting third. You kind of see some fun Pokemon in the top 32 range. Mainly you see a Gyarados getting 26th place. You got Mudsdale in 27th place. So, and then Entei in 31st place. So definitely some interesting picks that were happening at this regional championship. But overall, pretty much what you would expect from restricted duos and teams for the most part.
Yeah, a bunch of Lunalas, right? Like Lunala Groudon, I feel like a bunch of European players were on that trend before kind of the rest of the world. And so it finished second here. Slightly more offensive here with Charizard and Venusaur in the composition. And then you have Porygon 2 just as, you know, really good support. I think Porygon 2 has really, you know, shown up to be a very solid Pokemon recently, especially the Foul Play Eerie Impulse set with Trick Room. You know, it's good speed control. Foul Play is really good into things like Calyrex, but is still very bulky and difficult to knock out. To me, what was interesting is actually seeing some Lunala and Zacian teams here down at 31st and 32nd, just because I feel like that's still kind of a underexplored kind of composition. So Lunala usage definitely going up a little bit relative to where we were a few months ago, and that kind of brings me to the final tournament, which is Cybertron Regionals, because Wolfie actually did use Lunala Groudon to finish third in that event.
Yeah, there were quite a bit of interesting Pokemon in this regional top cut. Let me just say, I believe you also agree, but it was one of the most stacked top cuts I think for a regional championship that we've ever seen. Like this regional championship had 7 regional champions in this top 8, and
yep,
really it's incredible. Second place, a world's finisher. We have a top 8 US nationals finisher. We have Wolf, obviously there's so much you could say about him. Paul Chua, 6-time regional champion. Kyle Livinghouse has won regionals as well as getting top 8 NIC. Andrew Ding kind of been coming up recently, but he's still really strong, of course, and because he has multiple regionals cuts in like top 16 LIC. Justin Burns got second place at 2018 NIC. Then Santino, who he did win the first Players Cup as well as the Invitational that they did for Series 10. So these were some pretty stacked names, and the games were absolutely amazing. Highly recommend checking them out if you haven't. But a lot of these teams, oh boy, what can we talk about? Let's talk about the 2 Alcremies, I guess we're gonna see. Alex Underhill and Justin Burns getting second place and 7th place with Alcremie and Gothitelle. Pretty much what we saw with Alex Underhill. He did get top 4 at the Indianapolis Regional Championship with one Pokemon adjustment, which is the Alcremie, which replaces the Regieleki on the team. And I think it was a really cool pick, especially for this team, because one of the things that this team doesn't really like is Amoonguss and Spore pressure, but Alcremie with the Sweet Veil basically prevents that, and then the Decorate means he can't really play as defensively. And then of course Gothitelle Shadow Attack trapping is of course absolutely incredible. But
first of all, like, credits to Alex for Alex and Andrew, you know, they both top cut Indianapolis and Secaucus, and I think like this format is really hard in my opinion, and there's so much variance. There are so many good players that are playing these days, and the events are actually smaller, which can often make it more difficult because you're, you know, higher probability to run into good players earlier on, right? And so first of all, just huge credits to both Alex and Andrew for being very consistent in the last 2, you know, regionals. But I think the Alcremie is really smart for a bunch of reasons. Like you mentioned, Amoonguss is just a huge pain. It's also just good against Venusaur, you know, randomly using Sleep Powder. And then the Gothitelle on this team is a nightmare because it's, if I remember correctly, max speed Gothitelle. And so it can just spam like fast hypnosis. And with max speed investment, you actually outspeed like a lot of like the mid-tier speed Pokemon, right? And it's a nightmare because like when you give a really good player that tool, the chance of them just hitting the hypnosis, that 60% chance can make it an absolute disaster for you, right? And so I think it's really cool. I mean, Alchemy, I don't know if we saw it like too much on stream in the games that we had, but I got crushed by it actually on online play just like a couple of months ago, and I was like, this Pokemon is actually really good. Like the ability in itself already makes it good, but be able to get something to +2 is just like crazy, right? And so really cool to see that finally have a big tournament performance here. There's some other obvious trends here. One thing that I was really surprised by, or not surprised by, but it's funny, like Calyrex Palkia has been a duel that everyone's talked about for so long, especially since the first regionals in Salt Lake. I felt like it was underperforming, and now in this top 8 we had 3 different two of the Alchemy teams, and then Paul Chua also using Palkia and Calyrex. So it's interesting to see it finally have some stronger performances.
Yeah, and Paul's was really interesting because Aleki was Life Force physical with dual screen. And the Tapu Fini was a very surprise one. It was an Assault Vest set with Shadow Ball, which was a really interesting tech. And yeah, it definitely, I think, just is interesting. I think like a lot of players, a lot of their counters to like this Trick-Room team is usually Amoonguss. And obviously, Alcremie is one of the adjustments we see to help out with that matchup. But Tapu Fini, of course, Misty Surge is absolutely fantastic. And even though it can weaken the Palkia's max dragon attacks, you also prevent the Palkia from taking as much damage from opposing max dragons, which is definitely worth it. And the Tapu Fini being able to survive like a lot of attacks, able to take like Shadow Rider, for instance, Astral Barrage, which the team can have a little bit struggling switching into, and then fire off a Shadow Ball potentially. Oh boy, it is a big surprise factor that was able to do really well for Paul right there.
I also want to talk about Emilio winning the tournament undefeated. I know he's a good friend of yours, obviously a very amazing player, finishing second at Worlds back a few years ago. And, using Calyrex Zacian, this is one of the strongest cores, right? They're both very fast-paced and offensive, but I think Emilio really showed mastery of how to kind of maneuver with it. And I know he's played with the core for quite a while now, but tried out, different mons. I played him in Salt Lake, and I believe he had Blastoise back then over Gastrodon, so...
His team was actually one of the first teams that did really well in the format. It won an event. I don't remember which one it was. I believe it was online, but... The 6 has done really well consistently, and we saw like it also get top 8 in the special event of Bilbao's special event, and it did end up getting top 8 as well. So I think the team is pretty consistent. We've also seen some variants of the team. We've seen like Whimsicott over Rillaboom. We saw a lot of these kind of similar 6 basically in EUIC. A lot of them were actually in the top 64. It was actually probably the most used team in the top 64 actually. So it's not a team that's like, oh, it's brand new, but I think it's just mastered right here. And Emilio's been very comfortable with this team. I've definitely played him a lot with this version, and yeah, it's just a solid 6. It can do a lot of things that you absolutely would love to expect from like a pretty consistent team. You have like a lot of different modes. It's just a really strong overall team, and I think he was very comfortable with it and the game plans he could initiate.
One thing that's I think interesting, James, we've talked a lot about Zacian and Kyogre. If you look at like 11th place to 16th place, it's all Zacian and Kyogre. So this is what I mean, right? I feel like Zacian Groudon is definitely faded a little bit, and Zacian Kyogre has once again kind of retaken the throne, and it won Indianapolis Regionals, and there's just so many different variants of it running around right now. So the majority of the top 16 has that. You also have a couple more Calyrex Groudon teams, which I think is cool. Once again, that team just has so much late game potential with Calyrex Shadow Rider. And then, scrolling down a little bit more, there's a really cool kind of Kyurem and Calyrex Shadow Rider team. I think Kyurem's one of those Pokemon, like, it's tough for it to win tournaments, but it can, make good runs. And it's one of those Pokemon that people, like, often say, okay, my best game plan against Kyurem is to not fight Kyurem. And then you see it in Team Preview, and you're like, no way, like, I'm going up against it. So that can always be scary. And then, couple of other things, Rajon Ball here using Calyrex, Shadow Rider, and Dialga, which I think is really cool. Rajon and John Hu, by the way, we didn't talk about this in Indy, but they used a Lugia team. And honestly, I always thought Lugia was just like really difficult to use. And I still think it is, but I think they at least did a good job turning a Pokemon that can be maybe a little bit subpar and, you know, making it a lot better than most players would anticipate. And then Angelo here, a player with Calyrex and Dialga, also at 21st, and that team was pretty cool. I believe it was like 4 attack Life Orb Dialga with Speed Swap on Calyrex, Shadow Rider, you know, White Herb on Landorus, and then Trick Iron Ball, Fake Tear, Sucker Punch on Grimmsnarl.
Yeah, and then you also have like an Entei, Solgaleo in 29th. And the highest and only placing Rinya Sun team, which was actually 32nd, sneaked in by Tristan Medine. So yeah, it's just interesting that that's actually the highest placing Rinya Sun, and we really have not seen it, I think, that much. Even in like, I think some of the other regionals results, yeah, we just do not see it as much. I think like they have really fallen off. I don't even know if it got top 32 at Lily, and I'm looking over and I do not see it, I believe. So I think it's just really interesting to note how really I think things has changed, really.
I think a lot of players just aren't bringing it to begin with, because it, first of all, is a team that, you know, most people already know how to play, or not like fully know how to play against, but, you know, they know what to expect at least. You can have deviations in like your EV spreads and your items, but for the most part, you know what the composition is going to do and you know what its goals are. And for someone like Eric Rios, right, it makes sense for him to, you know, bring it to EUIC after winning regionals with it. You know, he's just such a phenomenal player, one of the best in the world right now, and has been for quite a long time. So it makes sense, right, because it's like he's really mastered the team. But that team can be really difficult to use, and if you don't really know what you're doing with it, you know, you can actually lose very easily, because these days, like, everyone's preparing for it. And so I'm curious to see if it like makes a resurgence in future tournaments, but for now I think most players are just opting not to even bring it in the first place because it can be really difficult to execute, and maybe a lot of players have actually shifted more over to like just using Zacian Kyogre, because Zacian Kyogre is just so consistent if you look at all these top 16 teams outside of the top 8.
Yeah, for sure. And I think yeah, there were actually 3 regional championships that happened over the weekend. We also had one in Australia, and I guess we could go over it real quick, but yeah, I mean, not too much to say from the top 8. I feel like we've all seen these kinds of teams at restricted pairs before, but it's actually kind of surprising that like a lot of these restricted pairs were kind of like originally at the beginning. So Zashi and Palkia won the first huge online major tournament and kind of made a resurgence at this event. It actually won with Alistair, and it also got 4th place by Ike. And then you have Sam, who's running kind of this colossal Yveltal Zacian, which has been a thing since the beginning of the format, but really hasn't placed too highly, especially of late, especially in official tournaments. Maybe some online tournaments it has done well, but like it's just really surprising to see like this kind of team make a comeback here. So I think it's pretty interesting of what's representing in Australia right now, as it does look a little bit different. But then there are some teams that you can pretty much see, like Alex running like the Calyx Shadow Groudon Sun stuff that we've seen before. We have like the Kyogre Zacian Pengi team from Ronaldo, and yeah, it's just really interesting, I think, how it's going to form, especially when we have like NIC going to be coming up in the last couple of regionals. It'll be interesting to see like how it'll deviate. And then I guess shout outs to the really cool Pokemon Sigilyph in 11th place in Australia. I'm assuming it's going to be gravity hypnosis stuff, but I mean, that's a really cool thing to showcase.
Yeah, gravity, honestly, like we haven't really seen it in this format, but it was actually one of my favorite moves back in 2016. You know, you would use it on Bronzong, and you could use it with like dual primals, for example, set up gravity. Groudon just hits everything with more accurate precipice blades, which always feels so good. I mean, having used Groudon in a couple tournaments now, like this Pokemon is so stressful because it's like, you know, when you use precipice blades, the odds of you missing are honestly decently high, right? So you're essentially expecting misses throughout your time using it. But it can really sting, right? Especially when you're missing a precipice blades on like a Zacian or Incineroar, for example. So one solution around that is, well, set up gravity, make it easier to hit your opponents. There are a couple of other interesting notes about this tournament is, you know, we were just talking about Rinya Sun and how it's kind of fallen off, but there were actually a bunch of players here in the, you know, 12 through 14 range that used Rinya Sun, or, you know, very slight deviations from it. And then Sableye actually finished in 15th place. I think that Pokemon's kind of been underplayed. Sableye is one of those tough ones where it's always like, it feels like it can be amazing and then absolutely useless and just fall off a cliff. So I think a lot of players just don't opt to use it to begin with, but has a lot of disruption between Will-O-Wisp and just having access to Prankster and all the stuff like they can do. So you know, it's always fun looking at the regional metagames and how things differ. To me, for Europe, for example, it was like more Venusaur-centric leading up to EUIC, and then now, you know, you see just a lot of these Zacian and Kyogre, but like dual weather teams, which I think is interesting, whether it be Torkoal or Charizard, for example. Lunala, Groudon once again picked up a little bit faster there. And then even though Calyrex, Ice Rider plus Reshiram kind of originated in Europe, like we saw it dominate in Indy. And then what was interesting was that like it basically didn't even scratch the top 32 of New Jersey. So it's like, I wonder if that was a one-time wonder, or is it that players just didn't really bring it to New Jersey?
I think it's kind of both. I think the team actually does kind of struggle with a bit of Kyogre, and I think we did see a lot of the top 16 that there were a lot of Kyogre players, so I wouldn't be surprised if either players didn't decide not to bring, because I was actually expecting quite a few, but I don't think I saw or like seen a single person really bring Cali Ice Reshiram. I think I only heard like one player actually brought it, and I don't think they even made the top 32 if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's just really interesting to see like how quickly things can change. And it's also just interesting to note that I believe that in Secaucus, New Jersey, literally this is the and as well as I guess Earth, that this is one of the first regionals in a while where one of Groudon or Kyogre hasn't won, which is actually just pretty interesting, I think, in general. And I think also what's cool is we've seen a lot more teams, I think, diversifying away from Zacian, something we predicted earlier back, I think, for the EUIC recap. And while I still think Zacian is really strong, it's still winning these regionals pretty consistently for the most part. The only one that didn't win, I think, out of this list was the Bilbao special event. But I think it's just really cool to see that there are a lot of like non-Zacian teams that are just doing well. And it's kind of like, you know, like Zacian, of course, amazing Pokemon. It's still going to be like a really consistent mon that's going to be doing well for the most part of the season. But there are just some teams that, like, you know, can play around Zacian and don't need the tools that it can provide. And I think we'll definitely see a bit more, but I'm honestly curious on how the future regionals and NAIC especially will shape up. Like, how consistent can Zacian stay on top, or will it fall?
I love that narrative, James, because for me, when it comes to Worlds time, that's where I'm so curious, right? It's like, does Zacian end up winning Worlds? Because it is such a good Pokemon, but as you mentioned, a lot of players now are exploring options outside of it, whether it be Palkia, Calyrex, Lunala, Groudon, for example. So to me, you know, to summarize the recent meta trends, Zacian is still really good, right? And Zacian is being paired with things that aren't just Kyogre or Groudon anymore. You know, I mean, Zacian, Calyrex, Zacian, Palkia, these were things that we actually saw maybe in the beginning of the format, but now have won major tournaments. And so, you know, multiple Zacian pairings doing really well. I feel like Zacian plus Kyogre nowadays is more the team to beat rather than the Rinya Sun team that was, you know, popularized a couple of months ago. And then I think, you know, the rise of new restricted Pokemon is just fun to see, right? Out of all the tournaments we talked about, Lunala had great performances, Reshiram had great performances, and then we also had some Pokemon, you know, just in the top 16 or top 32, whether it be Kyurem White or Dialga, for example. And so I'm curious to see, you know, have we exhausted the list of restricted Pokemon, or are there still a couple that players haven't really used, that have the potential to do well, right? Like Necrozma Duskmane is one that I'm curious about. I don't think it's super strong, but I also think it's kind of underplayed, so that's one I have my eye out on for kind of the upcoming majors. But yeah, those were some of my main takeaways after all of these tournaments.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of these, I think, when we're seeing regional champions, I'm pretty sure that what I would say to the viewers is, if you're trying to go to the events, if you're going to NIC or an upcoming regional, I think one of the best things you can do realistically is take a duo that, even though if you might not think it's good, but if you're comfortable with it, just keep playing it. Because a lot of these regional champions, I believe, most of these players have used their teams throughout like the entire season so far, like pretty close to it, I think, for the most part. I know Emilio and Pangy and Thomas are definitely three players who have grinded their teams out quite extensively and are very familiar with matchups. And yeah, I believe the same could be said by most of these players. So I think just continue with your team. Maybe you can find some small adjustments here or there, because there's always ways to evolve a team. Think about the ways your team's weak to a certain core and try to patch it. We've seen it with like the Alcremie, Tapu Fini changes. We've seen it with the Reshiram stuff, the Gothitelle adjustments. We've seen like a lot of these. Just end up exploring a little bit, get outside, be creative, because like really, like, you don't use creative Pokemon because they're creative. You use these Pokemon because they fulfill a certain niche and help with like certain matchups that your team doesn't like. And really, at the end of the day, that's probably the biggest lesson you could have here. And yeah, I think we've seen like from a lot of these players, the ones who are able to do well at these events usually are very comfortable with their team, and also they kind of have an understanding of what they can do, what their options are, what they're weak to, and how to patch it with like the individual changes, even if it's like some EV spread changes to some move slots to entirely different Pokemon.
Absolutely agreed. And I think like the last thing I would say is, this restricted format, even though it can be pretty top heavy, like yes, you see a lot of the same common sets. You know, the reality is that there are a lot of random restricted duos that you might go up against, especially in the earlier rounds of a tournament, right? And so those like pairs are often things that you're not going to go out of your way to prepare for, but they can really catch you off guard, and you know, it can just completely crush you, right? And so the idea is, the more comfort you have with a certain team or a composition, the easier it'll be for you to like come up with new game plans against restricted duos, right? For example, we saw like, you know, what was it, Calyrex and Calyrex Shadow Rider Dialga, Calyrex plus Kyurem. I can tell you, if I were practicing, and when I was practicing for New Jersey, those were not on my radar at all, right? And so comfort is honestly, I think, very, very valued, especially in this format where there's just so many random things.
I think that's going to wrap it up for this recap here. So I hope you all enjoyed this recap or regionals recap here. We also covered EUIC. Sorry that we've basically stacked all of these tournaments together, but hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like down below, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to Beastcoast Pokemon if you want to know more from me and Aaron. And we really enjoy doing these, so leave some feedback down below. And any last words, Aaron?
Nope, that's pretty much it. So good luck to everyone competing in the last couple of events leading up to the World Championships. We'll keep doing more of these. And yeah, let us know what other content you'd like to see from James and I here on the channel. So until next time.